Hello， 大家好，我是 Penny。今年呢，在疫情的大背景下，环境变迁的脚步呢并没有减慢。那今天呢，我们就来聊一聊2020年，环境变迁的这个话题。那首先呢，我们先来看一看2015年上映的迪士尼影片《明日世界》的一个片段。
That's enough, kid.
That's my house.
Would have been nice if Frank had prepared you for this. I'm afraid the world is ending. It is certain, it is unavoidable, and it is coming.
刚刚影片中的场景呢，其实在全球各地的现实中都有映射。那具体到今年呢，除了中国的洪水，美国也是干的干，涝的涝。那么我们的环境在今年到底经历了什么样的改变呢？那我们又能做些什么呢？那8月14号，《经济学家》杂志就做了一期以环境为主题的广播。那我们现在就一起去听一听吧。
First up, though, the past decade was the hottest ever globally, and 2019 was one of the 3 hottest years on record. That's according to this week's State of the Climate report from the American Meteorological Society. It's known as the annual physical of the climate system, and it makes for increasingly grim reading.
This is the kind of emergency that scientists say is made much more likely and more damaging by climate change. Tens of thousands of people driven from
Last year, devastating wildfires ripped through Australia.
The intensity of it, it's like an apocalypse. It's like something that you've never experienced before.
Huge heat waves seared America, Europe, and India. In the tropics, there were almost 100 cyclones. At the poles, sea ice just kept melting.
Alaska's blue-white giants are dying.
Now, I've got to talk about the ice in Greenland because it's melting a lot
Iceland
faster.
may have to change its name.
But there were also huge global protests as environmental groups such as Extinction Rebellion took to the streets to call for greater urgency in the fight against climate change. To look at this year's report, though, it seems that fight is so far being lost.
So certainly the most striking finding was that July 2019 ranks as the hottest month in the historical record.
Dylan Barry writes about science for The Economist.
And I can attest, being in Amsterdam and Brussels for their record-breaking temperatures, that it was hot.
And what else does the report lay out?
So there are a few other interesting findings in the report. The first is that looking in ice cores dating back hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions of years, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have reached their highest levels in 800,000 years. As long as our species has been around, we have not seen these levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. A second concerning finding is that sea levels have already risen almost 10 centimeters in aggregate over the last 150 odd years. This is a record high, meaning that the levels of sea level rise have increased each year for the last 8 years. Unfortunately, although 10 centimeters doesn't sound like a hell of a lot, it means that we've actually locked ourselves into over a meter of change over the next 150, 200 years.
So that's the picture for 2019. What do we know so far about 2020?
So interestingly enough, a second report came out the day before the AMS's report, a report looking at July 2020 in the United States by the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. 2 results stuck out. We expect climatic events to become more extreme and to become more unequally distributed. We see this in the States this year with a much wetter than usual year across the country as a whole, but very unequally distributed, with the north and east experiencing a lot of rainfall, but the third of the country experiencing higher levels of drought than usual. A second concerning trend is that the hurricane season this year has seemed to move quite dramatically earlier in the season than usual. The 9 earliest recorded hurricanes in the season all were recorded before the month of August, which is the first time that this has happened.
And what about the drop in emissions caused by global lockdowns? We have talked on the show in the past about the degree to which that would have an effect or not.
So we have seen quite a substantial reduction in global emissions. In the first quarter of the year, daily emissions were about 17% below the same period in 2019. But while this is helpful in the short term, it really is a drop in the ocean in the long term, and unfortunately is not going to give us much breathing room on having to deal with climate change. A more significant development that may have longer-term impacts on the way that we deal with climate change is the way in which the pandemic has forced countries, nation-states, and blocs across the world to reconsider the role and expanse of fiscal policy. As we've seen in the United States and Europe, countries have rediscovered the importance and the utility of being able to pump money into the economy. And in the context in which countries previously were unwilling to put out the amounts of money needed to invest in climate infrastructure and climate-based investment, it's not impossible that this sea change in our approach to macroeconomics might actually create the room to pump the kinds of money and the kinds of investment into dealing with climate change that will be necessary to combat it.
So essentially people will commit the money when they think that the cause is urgent enough. It's just a matter of will these same people, will these same voters reckon that the climate situation is urgent enough?
Ultimately, unfortunately, it's going to require very substantial amounts of public pressure and electoral pressure on politicians and governments to really put in the kinds of money, effort, and persistent commitment that will be required to tackle climate change. Fortunately, there are some encouraging signs on that. Globally, it's looked like over the last decade that climate change has become one of the greater concerns of most people across most of the developing world. And this has accelerated in the last couple of years. So, for example, compared with a decade ago, more Americans say protecting the environment and dealing with global climate change should be top priorities for the President and Congress. And 2020 was, in fact, the first time that a majority of Americans said it should be a top priority for Congress and the President.
And how is that evidently global trend reflected in the business world?
So, in the same way that change is greatly accelerated by high levels of public consensus and electoral pressure, it also really helps to have market pressure on your side. And one of the really encouraging trends we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been rapid increases in competitiveness of renewable technologies, which has meant that for the first time over the last couple of years, it's actually increasingly become more cost-effective to fight climate change than to not fight climate change in terms of the energy sources that you use. An additional trend that is quite interesting, Tesla for the first time reported profits for the first full calendar year, which also suggests that we're seeing shifts in people's demand. So not just the pressure on cost, but also on people's willingness and excitement to buy renewable, consistent technologies.
So it's a bit of a mixed picture. The reports that you speak of give some very worrying numbers, yet at the same time, if you look to markets and recent history and what governments and some companies are doing, it's sort of positive trends. I mean, where does this all balance out, to your mind?
So yeah, it's a really mixed bag. I think first and foremost, globally, we're not doing nearly enough to combat climate change. And I think that's the fundamental thrust of both of the reports that we discussed and should be of concern to all of us. There are some bright spots. Of particular interest, I think, should be the extent to which this is really an important issue for younger voters and younger generations that are increasingly becoming an important part of electoral politics and increasingly making their voices known through electoral pressure. We see this in the UK, for example, in the activities of Extinction Rebellion, and in the States with the increasing influence of the Sunrise Movement. Ultimately, though, whatever happens, we're going to look back on 2020 as an important point in the development of the way in which we will have dealt with climate change, particularly because of the upcoming November election in the United States. It's unclear yet quite how big a part climate change or concerns over the environment will play in the election, but the two candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, have very opposing policy positions on the way in which to deal with climate change. If we see another 4 years of Trump, unfortunately, it will set back attempts to combat and mitigate climate change substantially, whereas Joe Biden, on the complete other end of the spectrum, has actually put out quite ambitious plans for tackling climate change. So ultimately, 2020 may prove an inflection point or it may be remembered as a year where we really missed the chance to make great inroads in combating climate change.
Dylan, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.